Nazia Akhtar, and this panel is called Minoritized Women and Girls. We have 4 speakers, 3 of whom are here in person, and Dr. Laura Roldán-Sevillano, I hope I've got that right, is joining us online. So without further ado, let me invite our first speaker, who's Dr. Kasey Jones-Matrona of the University of Oklahoma, who currently holds an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellowship in Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. She completed her PhD in Native American literature at the University of Oklahoma in May 2021. She's a settler scholar from Maryland, USA. Her research interests include indigenous futurisms, indigenous feminisms, Anthropocene and climate literature, indigenous digital storytelling and activism, and environmental humanities. Dr. Jones-Matrona.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to be here today at this important conference, and I'd like to share some of my research on Native American young adult speculative fiction novels today. Okay. Before I introduce my argument and the novels, I'll briefly cover these key concepts, as you can see on the screen, which are pivotal in my understanding of contemporary Indigenous speculative fiction. Indigenous Futurisms is a term coined by Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon. It is inspired by Afrofuturism, but in my own brief definition from Dillon's scholarship, Indigenous Futurisms is a movement of literature, visual art, film, gaming, music, and related activism that often places Indigenous peoples in the future and/or re-examines the past to combat the trend of representing Indigenous cultures as dead cultures. Indigenous Feminisms, as a term, dates back to Laguna Pueblo scholar Paula Gunn Allen's term tribal feminisms, which is the study of gender, culture, sovereignty, and politics in Indigenous communities with a strong focus on recovering gynocratic and matrilineal roots. Andrea Smith argues that Native feminisms are crucial because, quote, gender justice is often articulated as a separate issue from issues of survival for Indigenous peoples, end quote. Smith contends, however, that decolonization cannot occur without addressing sexism and violence against women. Indian Country Today reports that Native American women are 2.5 times more likely than any other ethnicity in America to be sexually assaulted. And a report on the results of the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey found that 49% of Native women report a history of sexual violence. Colonization, decolonization, and gender violence thus are intersecting issues. The novels I'll discuss, which I'll introduce in a minute here, both include various forms of trauma, one being violence against Indigenous women, whether in plot or through memory and flashback. Many young adult literature studies show that the inclusion of trauma or other triggering topics is intentional at times to address what teens and young adults have experienced or witnessed in their lives. Paluku young adult novelist Ambelin Quamelina stated in an interview, quote, the stories that shape and inspire and comfort the diverse children and teenagers of this world are not the stories they'll read when they're all grown up. It's the stories that speak to who they are now. That is why it is so important to ensure not only that the young have access to stories, but that at least some of these stories are written by and about someone like them, end quote. Jerry Dimmeline states, quote, I also really needed Indigenous youth to see themselves in the future and not just holding on by the skin of their teeth, kind surviving, but being heroes and leaders, end quote. Representation in literature is always crucial, but representing ingenuity, leadership, and hope is also vital. In her edited collection, So Long Been Dreaming, Post-Colonial Science Fiction, Nalo Hopkinson writes that, quote, one of the most familiar memes of science fiction is that of going to foreign countries and colonizing the natives. And for many of us, that's not a thrilling adventure story, it's nonfiction, end quote. Therefore, my argument is that reversing this lens and representing the survivance of Indigenous youth through colonial catastrophe is a radical act. So, in The Marrow Thieves and Trail of Lightning, the two novels I'll be discussing, the post-catastrophic worlds are not yet without violence, and the young protagonists must fight against physical and spiritual assaults, but a reckoning with injustice against Indigenous women and attacks on traditional tribal cultures is in full force. I argue that these texts, among others, pave the way for a new wave of Indigenous feminist futures, both in art and in practiced activism, where Indigenous girls and women as protagonists trailblaze to create worlds that move beyond dystopia and mere survival, and seek to reinstate matrilineal and matriarchal Indigenous-centric worlds devoid of patriarchal violence. I have the images of both novels here on the right side of the slide. The top is Trail of Lightning, and the bottom is The Marrow Thieves. So both Trail of Lightning by Pueblo author Rebecca Roanhorse and The Marrow Thieves by Métis author Cherry Dimeline feature post-apocalyptic or catastrophic worlds. And just a side note here, I'll use catastrophe instead of apocalypse just to avoid any specific religious implications here. But post-catastrophic worlds in the Americas due to climate disasters. Another connected topic that would entail its own presentation, linking gender violence, climate change, colonialism, and capitalism. But dreaming, recovering, and utilizing ancestral powers and traditions, and recovering from trauma through community building and bonding are also shared ties between these two novels. Maggie, the Dene main character of Trail of Lightning, becomes a monster slayer who teams up with Kai, a medicine man with elemental clan powers in Trail of Lightning. Maggie utilizes violence and rage to survive and kill monsters instead of being hunted herself. But Nezgani, the possessive monster slayer who trained her, comes back to claim her later in the novel. Maggie has to make difficult decisions about who to direct her violence and rage toward, while dealing with flashbacks of men who have attacked her, and using that as motivation to slay monsters, both physical and metaphorical, internal and external. In The Marrow Thieves, three of the central characters, Wab, Minerva, and Frenchie, make up part of a pan-Indigenous group in what used to be Canada, and are now being hunted by a new sector of the remaining Canadian government, the Marrow Thieves, who capture and experiment with Indigenous peoples for their DNA. They're the only ones who are still able to dream in this post-catastrophic world. They all shared their coming to stories of life before and during the climate disaster, but Wab is more reluctant than most. She is quiet but strikingly beautiful, as described by Frenchie, with a long scar across her face. When she gains trust with the group and shares her story, they learn that she was captured and sexually assaulted by a group of men with whom she was trading food. She continues to heal by building relationships with her group, teaching the other young characters like Frenchie how to hunt and gather food using her tribal knowledge in a way that is reciprocal with the natural world and non-human entities. Minerva is an elder who teaches the young ones her tribal language, but is eventually captured by the Marrow Thieves. Her memories, language, and songs are so powerful, though, that she destroys a residential school where she's being held. Reckoning with violence, whether employing it themselves as protection or sharing their trauma and starting to find some healing, is central in both of these novels. Because of these reckonings, the main characters are able to carve out roles and spaces for themselves in these new worlds. The image on this slide is an artwork by Crow artist Wendy Redstar, and it's called Hoop in the Cloud. And I think this is an excellent visual representation of Indigenous feminist futures. So in the way that feminism has waves, I kind of see this movement of Indigenous futurisms also starting to produce these waves. And I think that the two novels that I've briefly shared with you all today are this kind of space or wave where we have an ultimate kind of catastrophe, but remnants of the old world and symptoms of colonial patriarchal violence are still to be grappled with. So what I see and am excited for in the future of some of this YA literature is moving beyond a reckoning with these consequences in literary worlds. I want to be specific. This arguably is not or may not ever be possible, right? In real worlds, ever kind of totally overcoming colonial violence and all that that entails. This isn't to say that there are not any novels out there already creating matriarchal and matrilineal worlds in fiction, but I predict that this group of YA novels paves the way for moving beyond a reckoning. To vividly imagine worlds devoid of colonialism and what that would look like for Indigenous communities. And for young readers and consumers, these literary worlds open up a range of possibility for real-world action and activism to draw closer to Indigenous leadership and lifeways that decolonizes the symptoms of colonial patriarchy. These are the texts that I've quoted and referenced during my presentation, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jones-Matrona. Our next speaker is online, and this is Dr. Laura Roldán-Sevillano, who is a PhD and a lecturer in the Department of English Philology at the University of Zaragoza. Her PhD thesis focuses on the representation of sexist/racist violence against racialized women in US ethnic women's fiction of the 2010s. Laura's main research interests are contemporary US ethnic literatures with a focus on post-colonial trauma, gender-based violence, and perpetrator studies. She has shared her research work in different publications and national and international conferences. She's also done 3 research stays at the University of Leeds, Michigan State University, and the Instituto Franklin, UAH, Spain. Laura, the floor is yours.
So thank you for having me today in such an interesting and necessary event. And thank you for the introduction to this presentation that I have entitled New Millennium Narratives of Sexual Violence Against US Ethnic Women, a We Too Literary Movement in the Making. So please could you pass to the following slide? Thank you. So one of the key defining issues of our current era is the persistence of sexism and the sustained attacks against women, especially those of color, as we have been commenting today. Sadly, 1 out of 3 women in the world suffers physical or sexual violence today, and particularly in the US, every 9 out of 10 victims of sexual assault and rape are women. And this is especially the case of women of color, who, by the way, are less prone to inform about those aggressions. So such harrowing data drove me to carry out my research on the potential existence of new millennium literature by US ethnic women, which represents and by extension criticizes a kind of violence founded not on the gender factor only, but as many academics have argued, and we know already, on it's founded on intersectional oppression. So can you please pass to the following slide, thanks. So given that as different scholars have recently observed that, especially since the turn of the new millennium, that many contemporary writers have been abandoning or renewing their formerly postmodern style in favor of more realist forms that shine out in this post-truth era, I decided to investigate in this direction. And following this new turn to realism, soon I found what I regard a current tendency in some US ethnic women writers who are penning traditionally realist narratives to denounce the sexist and racial violence experienced in their communities today. And this is the case of some contemporary authors that you can find on the slide, like Alicia Gaspar de Alba, she's Chicana, Luis Erdrich, Native American, Roxanne Gay, Asian American, or Kelly Young, Asian American, and among others. These authors here, for example, have published realist narratives with the aim of exposing and denouncing how the violence suffered by contemporary women from their respective ethnic groups is related to the historical, cultural, and collective suffering of the peoples. And in this sense, they are what I call an activist movement in the making. So please, can you pass to the following slide? Thanks. So for this paper, I will focus only on Erdrich's The Roundhouse and Gay's Untamed State due to a matter of scope and time, and also because they are the novels that I have been working on recently. As I will explain, following a literary tendency started in the 1980s in which US authors tried to, and I quote from Professor Robin Field, to educate readers about what rape is, and quote, by telling rape stories that were meant to provide in-depth accounts of the physical and psychological traumatic repercussions of sexual violence in order to increase the readership's awareness of these scourge. As somehow I will explain in these two narratives follow that similar path, right? Albeit with different narrative techniques, because the Roundhouse is narrated through the perspective of the victim survivor's young son, and in the case of Untamed State, this story is recounted by the victim survivor herself. So as I will explain, in both narratives, readers are offered a representation and condemnation of the intersecting causes behind the violence suffered by the respective Native American and Asian American female characters by means of a realist and accessible prose and a mixture of popular genres aimed at spreading the novel's denunciation to a wider audience. And lastly, I will conclude this paper by demonstrating that both novels render rape female survivors not as eternal victims, but as strong women who can heal, grow personally, and even achieve self-empowerment thanks to their individual resilience, their cultural roots, as well as collective support. So please, can you pass? Thank you. So The Roundhouse is Louis Erdrich's 14th novel. It is set on a Anishinaabe reservation in North Dakota in the late 1980s. And this novel, as I said, is told from the adult perspective of a 13-year-old boy, Joe Coots, whose mother, Geraldine, is violently raped and almost killed by a white man. This aggression takes place in the Roundhouse, a ceremonial building which Joe's ancestors built and which happens to be located in an area where tribal, state, and federal lands meet. And such a legal entanglement, as readers learn in the novel, makes it impossible to specify a jurisdiction to prosecute the white perpetrator. So when Joe's father, Basil, a tribal judge, fails to find justice for his wife, Joe decides to solve the crimes himself aided by his friends. And this leads him to kill the rapist with the help of one of them. Yet the burden of this terrible act will mark the end of his childhood forever. So in short, we have here the story of a mother who is sexually abused by but her rape and attempted murder takes place off scene. However, by means of Joe's retrospective but quite objective narration, Geraldine is presented as both victim and a resilient survivor of the attack, as we shall see in a minute. So before analyzing the novel, it is important to remark that Erdrich is a renowned and prolific contemporary Native American author, and she's well known for her complex literary style. But interestingly enough, in order to denounce the systemic violence suffered by Native women on reservations across the US, and in order to raise awareness about this issue in a wider readership, in the Roundhouse, Erdrich adapts her writing by creating a unique novel with some crucial innovations. One of these changes is the inclusion of a young male protagonist narrator instead of a constellation of voices like in former novels, which makes this text easier to follow. Another innovation is the elaboration of a plot more clearly related to Euro-American mainstream genres than ever before. Particularly, we can find elements of the detective novel and the coming-of-age novel of roguish and nomadic US heroes like Mark Twain's Huck Finn. And this obviously is chosen to appeal, the white readers. And she mixes these elements with a popular Native American genre common in her work, the trickster story. Also, there is a conspicuous turn to a more linear, stripped-down and traditionally realist prose through which Erdrich portrays lifelike characters, and the impossibility of a protective jurisdiction for Native women and their families caused by Native tribes' lack of sovereignty on reservations, a fact that Erdrich supports with explicit references to the history of Anishinaabe dispossession, including laws. Moreover, Erdrich infuses her novel with what Field refers to as traumatic realism, for it depicts, and I quote from Professor Field, physical and psychological pain and post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as the cultural, historical, social, and temporal circumstances that influence the impact of the trauma upon victim survivors, end quote. In this particular case, Erdrich renders the traumatic reality of Geraldine and her family as in relation to the terrible effects that sexual violence alongside the institutional one perpetrated by the US government provoke in Native American families on reservations, and see that so through Joe's point of view, whereby Erdrich provides a faithful depiction of the traumatic, of the PTSD experienced by Geraldine following the traumatic event, as we can observe in the following slide. Thank you. So I don't have time to read all the quotations in fully, but I can say that particularly Joe portrays his mother as a skinny, disoriented, and invaded woman with erratic sleep habits, as you can see in quotation 2. That also he refers to her continuous weeping and loss of appetite, and to her continuous fear and responses of hypervigilance, as you can see in quotations 1, and also in quotation 3 in the following slide, please. Thank you. And these are common symptoms among traumatized subjects. Likewise, the novel portrays Geraldine through Joe's eyes as a ghostly entity, as a living dead. And I read in quotation 4, the letters in bold. Anything would have been better than the frozen suspension of feeling which she mounted the stairs. Her steps were soundless, they seemed to float, end quote. However, can you please pass? Thank you. However, despite all these trauma symptoms, the novel shows that healing for Geraldine is possible. And well, albeit slowly, she starts getting better thanks to the help of her family in the community. And particularly important in her improvement is Linda Wishkop, a white woman adopted by a native family from the reservation, who catalyzes Geraldine's healing process with her visits and chats. So in a way, the conversations with Linda work as a talking cure in the Freudian sense of the term, as well as a powerful reminder of the key role that the community and relational ethics play for Native American people's welfare. In addition, when thanks to Linda, Geraldine is able to regain control over her traumatic memories and other intrusive PTSD symptoms, she remembers the traumatic event and speaks up the trauma she was repressing, as you can see in quotation 5. I quote, "I was raped, Basil. I remember everything," end quote. And this testimony of the attack can be considered the beginning of Geraldine's process of working through, which materializes in her return to her work, and to her cooking and gardening routines. In addition, as Geraldine remembers the traumatic event, she reveals her family that she was not alone, that the rapist killed Myla Wolfskin, a young native woman who had a baby with her boss, Governor Curtis, who is a bigoted white man who now wants to adopt the surviving baby, because the baby survives, for spurious reasons. And this is the reason why when Geraldine hears about the baby's survival, she wakes up from her traumatic numbness and gets up from her bed all of a sudden, as you can see in quotation 6. She says, "What child? My mother raised herself in bed, clutching. Then she actually got out of bed, and she starts talking about Myla." Please, can you pass the slide? Thank you. So after this episode, Geraldine gradually recovers her memory, and thus her family, and by extension readers, learn that what happened in the day of the traumatic event was that Geraldine, who works as a tribal record keeper, had agreed on helping Myla with some paperwork related to the baby, and this mingling with the case, she was attacked and almost murdered by Lyndon Lark, a white man who works for the governor and who was interested in Myla and or the dirty money she had received from the governor. The novel, I don't think it makes it clear. With this information, Lyndon is put in custody, yet the problem is that he is soon released due to the jurisdictional maze on the spot where the attack happened. And thus, while Geraldine had quickly gone back to work to help the baby and its native grandparents so that they could adopt him or her, once Lyndon is released, Geraldine returns to her former state of numbness. And this is the reason why Joe decides to kill Lyndon. A hideous action, yes, but on the other hand, it serves well as a kind of alternative justice for Geraldine, her family, and the community too. And as for Geraldine, once Lyndon is dead, she takes care of her tours again, especially the garden, something which points to her reconnection with the land and traditional stories related to it, and reinforces her identity as a Nazi woman, as Silvia Martinez Falquina has argued. So finally, in relation to this novel, it is important to remark that although Geraldine's healing is not complete as suggested by the novel's ending, when Joe explains that his mother, Basil, and himself carry the scars of the traumatic experience, she and her family are resilient, for as the novel says at the end, they kept on going. And then the following slide, thank you. Very briefly, Untitled State is the debut novel of Haitian American author Roxane Gay, which revolves around Muriel Duval Jameson, a Haitian American lawyer kidnapped by a gang from the slums of Port-au-Prince. And the leader of this armed group demands Muriel's father, a returned Haitian expat in Nouveau Riche, $1 million ransom that he can afford, but that he's unwilling to pay because he considers these youngsters lazy men or young men instead of taking into consideration the socio-political, economic, and historical, as well as post-colonial causes that make this man, commit this crime. This negative response results in the torture and gang rape of Mirel, who will end up suffering a clear case of PTSD after her release. So in this first-person narrative, which mixes conventions of the postmodern fairy tale revisions and the thriller, as well as traditional social realist narratives, as I have explained elsewhere in an article that I published in 2021, Gay also offers a very realistic and detailed portrayal of rape, more than Edric even, because here the sexual abuse of the protagonist takes place on scene, as you can see in quotation 7. I read a bit. I scratched and kicked and screamed and spit in his face. He stripped me of my clothing, pulling me up by my hips, forcing my thighs apart with his, forcing himself inside me. I looked down at my thighs and saw blood in the dim light. End quote. So can you pass, please? Thank you. So after her kidnapping and rape, Mirel's complete disempowerment, provoked by the repeated sexual abuses and tortures perpetrated by her captors for 13 days during the summer of 2008, makes her sink into a process of traumatic dissociation whereby her mind tries to repress the violence she's enduring, but she still keeps having this compulsive repetition of the traumatic event through involuntary flashbacks and haunting nightmares. Also, she falls into a depressive state and has loss of appetite as well as a sense of, how can I put it? She has an incessant self-conception as no one, as a dead woman. And as I have explained in this article I have mentioned before, Mirel is somehow depicted as a Haitian zombie, a figure historically related to Haitian slavery and which can be defined as an undead body or spirit subdued to the command of a sorcerer, the Bokor, which in this case is the leader of the gang especially, that turns the victim into I quote from Kayama Glover, a being without essence, end quote. Likewise, Mirel suffers paranoid and hallucinatory episodes, constant fear and sense of hypervigilance, as Geraldine in the previous novel, and she cannot even stand the physical contact with others, including her husband. So everything she tries to repress her trauma proves futile. And ironically enough, although once she flees Haiti, and please can you pass the slide? Thank you. Once she flees Haiti, supposedly forever, because she knows that well enough that Haitian institutions will not prosecute her victimizers, she feels momentarily safe in the States. But I say momentarily because her husband attempts to confine her with the pretext of keeping her safe until she heals. But this makes her more anxious and out of control, for she feels that she's being trapped one more time. And this reminds me of the yellow wallpaper, you know, the famous story by Perkin Gilmans. So such a situation propels her to flee to her parents-in-law's farmhouse in Nebraska in the countryside, where she begins her healing process thanks to her mother-in-law, Lorraine, a sort of fairy godmother who takes care of her and actively listens to her as well. And this act of escapism, rather than cowardice, denotes that Mirel is a strong woman like her Haitian rebellious forefathers and mothers, the Haitian runaway slaves, the Haitian maroons, who not only escaped the plantations, but also participated in the Haitian Revolution, seeking the country's colonial emancipation and the liberation from their trauma, this cultural collective trauma of slavery. So, and thanks to Lorraine, Mirel's sister, and a kindly-hearted female doctor, Mirel improves her physical and psychological health, although she accepts the bodily and psychic scars that will always remain in her body. Essentially, similarly to other victims of trauma, Mirelle is no longer the woman she was before her ordeal. However, she gradually grows strong enough to rebuild herself, her life, and her marriage. Hence, the novel arguably presents Mirelle not as an eternal victim, but as a survivor. However, in order to finish, it must be acknowledged that despite the aforementioned attempts to move on, Mira's healing process is only partially completed until she faces her homeland again, as well as the two men who caused her so much pain. So on the one hand, Mira comes back to Port-au-Prince after the 2010 earthquake to grant what she calls feigned forgiveness to her repentant father. And that's something that denotes that she has somehow worked through that trauma of going back and facing her father. And on the other hand, Mira encounters and confronts the leader of the gang when she sees him at the Miami restaurant where he is working years later, because she no longer feels afraid of her perpetrator. And in fact, she chases and hits him until he escapes. So through this confrontation with the villain of her story, Mirelle proves to be the owner of her body and will again. And this recuperation of her subjectivity that reminds me a bit of this confrontation or recuperation of their subjectivity in the Haitian Revolution. I mean, the Haitian ex-slaves allows her to become empowered and eventually verbalize her trauma by narrating her testimony to an implied reader sometime later. So this is, I guess, the ultimate step in her working through process. In sum, despite her PTSD, if one closely examines Mirelle's post-traumatic decisions, it can be noticed that this character, who I think epitomizes the traditional Haitian saying "Kembe fem," stay strong, that encapsulates the historical, resistant and resilient nature of the people of Haiti, is revealed as an instrument whereby the author shows that post-traumatic healing, albeit a difficult process, may be possible for abused women like Mirelle. So yeah, thank you. As a way of conclusion, I can say that as I tried to demonstrate that The Roundhouse and Untamed State are two trauma novels that denounce the scourge of sexual violence through traditionally realist and traumatic realist narratives. They do not re-victimize the fictional female victim survivors because they portray them as resilient women who struggle but gradually return to their lives. Also, they confirm that culturally specific working through and post-traumatic growth is possible in following the line that recent the recent wave of trauma theory is following. And finally, they confirm a literary tendency among U.S. ethnic women writers of the new millennium that are using literature as a weapon of denunciation and resistance against sexual violence against ethnic women. So I think that there are two examples of this, early literary Me Too movement in the making in the new millennium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Roldán-Sevillano. Our next speaker is Dr. Hilary McCollum, whom none of you know, so I'm going to introduce her again. Hilary McCollum is the publishing fellow at the Seamus Heaney Center, where she recently completed her PhD on recreating the lesbian past through historical fiction. She's a writer and creative activist. Her first novel, Gold Digger, won the 2016 Golden Crown Literary Society Prize for Historical Fiction. Her memoir of sexual abuse against the backdrop of the Troubles, Funny Peculiar, was published in 2008 under the pseudonym Constance McCullough. I'm sure I've messed that up. Please excuse me. Yeah. Her fiction and plays often explore issues related to violence against women and girls. Hilary.
Thank you. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the representation of violence against women and girls in lesbian historical fiction. Except that doesn't want to click on. Can you move it to the next one? Ah, there we go. In common with many aspects of lesbian experience, violence against lesbians is under-acknowledged, under-discussed, under-researched, and under-theorised, even within the lesbian community. It's interesting to me, therefore, that violence against women and girls is frequently and powerfully explored within lesbian historical fiction, featuring in almost a quarter of lesbian historical novels. The violence represented includes types of male violence that all women and girls are at risk from, rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment that's linked to their sex. But it also includes violence targeted at lesbians, specifically physical and sexual assaults motivated by homophobia. Lesbian historical novels are derived from historical records and have the capacity to represent the past, albeit imperfectly. They provide a powerful means of narrating a history of female same-sex love and desire, challenging the male domination of traditional history in which women's lives and relationships are marginalised. But historical novels are also contemporary novels reflecting the preoccupations of the present. Carolyn Dinshaw suggests that the concerns of the present can illuminate the past, but it's also the case that representation of the past can illuminate present concerns. And I'm going to use a few examples to illustrate how lesbian historical fiction can help to make visible violence against women and girls in the past and challenge it in the present. The first novel I'm going to talk about is Anne-Marie MacDonald's Gothic family saga, Fall on Your Knees, which I love as a novel despite the cover. It features a woman who's violently punished for pursuing a lesbian relationship. It's a story of domestic terrorism in which child marriage, domestic abuse, incest and rape interact with racial and sexual identities to shape the lives and destinies of the female characters. Set in Canada and New York from the 1890s to 1960s, the story revolves around the consequences of James Piper's incestuous desire for his eldest daughter, Kathleen. He rapes her when she's 18 after finding her in bed with her black female lover, Rose Lacroix. The novel's haunted by the secrets and lies that surround Kathleen's resulting pregnancy and death during a botched caesarean conducted by her mother. Kathleen's relationship with the woman is not revealed until book 8 of 9, perhaps hinting at the concealment of knowledge of lesbianism in the past. Her daughter Lily sees her mother fall in love in the pages of a forgotten diary. The diary ends with Kathleen full of hope for the future. "Oh diary, my loyal friend, there is love, there is music, there is no limit, there is work. There is the precious sense that this is the hour of grace when all things gather and distill to create the rest of my life. I don't believe in God, I believe in everything, and I am amazed at how blessed I am." The reader already knows she'll be dead 9 months later, and discovers soon after that it was her abusive father that impregnated her. Whilst MacDonald's depiction of the material details of women's lives is in keeping with the time period in which the novel is set, her representation of the tragic and sometimes fatal consequences of domestic and sexual violence in the family resonates with women's experiences in the present. The depiction of sexual harassment in Emma Donoghue's Life Mask also displays this resonance. Set amongst London's elite in the shadow of the French Revolution and French Revolutionary Wars, Life Mask features a love triangle involving 3 real historical figures: the widowed Honourable Mrs. Anne Damer, one of the first female sculptors in Britain, the celebrated comedy actress Eliza Farren, and the 12th Earl of Derby, a wealthy aristocrat. Donoghue depicts a world in which women must guard their reputation or risk serious consequences. It's women's responsibility to deal with unwanted and uninvited sexual behaviour from men. When Eliza goes to view this portrait that society artist Tom Lawrence has painted of her, he forces himself upon her. His hands were under her cloak, his legs seized hers. He was wrenching away her muslin fichu. Only when his fingers plunged into her bodice did she manage to move. She shoved him away so hard that he staggered into his easel, and the portrait fell face down on the smeared floor. Donoghue often uses clothing to convey the historical world to the reader, and details like the cloak, fichu and bodice all help to locate the scene in the late 18th century. However, Tom Lawrence's behaviour is reminiscent of the routine sexual harassment that women still face today. There's an allegorical quality here, with Donoghue commenting on issues of the present as well as the past. Women writers have frequently used historical fiction as a political tool to comment on the present. Chinua Okparanta's Under the Udala Trees is a coming-of-age, coming-out novel set against the backdrop of the Biafran War and its aftermath. The novel explores interethnic conflict and religiously inspired homophobia during the late 1960s and 70s, but it's also an allegory for the treatment of lesbians and gay men in present-day Nigeria, where violent persecution is commonplace and same-sex sexual activity for both women and men can result in lengthy imprisonment. The protagonist, Ijeoma, goes with her lover Ndidi to a secret women's club in 1970s Nigeria, its existence concealed by its location in a church. One night, a group of men bang on the church's front door. Most of the women escape out of the rear entrance to a hidden bunker, packing in tightly like stacked up tubers of yams. Outside, they hear screams and cries and a man's thundering voice, as if reciting a prayer. But fearing for themselves, they stay hidden. When they finally emerge, they find a stack of burning logs behind the church, and in its midst their friend Adana, burning and turning to ashes before our eyes. Under the idolatries demonstrates the continuing power of patriarchal religion to control women's lives and choices, and the sanctions that women who resist or reject heterosexuality and gendered expectations may face. Stevie Davis's Impassioned Clay also explores the power of religion to incite and perpetrate violence against women. The skeleton of a woman who has been hanged wearing a scold's bridle is found in a Lancashire garden. An archaeologist explains that the bridle's role was to shut her up for good. Impassioned Clay combines the archival quest of contemporary lesbian historian Olivia with multiple narratives of the past that she discovers. These include the diaries of the dead woman Hannah Emanuel, her lover, and the 17th century preacher who persecuted her. Davis viscerally describes the torture meted out to women who refused patriarchal religious doctrine and insisted on speaking their mind. Hannah is ducked in a filthy pool, half stripped and fitted with a scold's bridle, and this is an image of a scold's bridle. An iron cage, a stone in weight, with a bit 2 inches long, ending in 9 iron pins with sharp points. I was forced to open my mouth to receive the spikes. Blood filled my mouth and throat. She's led through the streets on a rope attached to the bridle. Eventually she's found guilty of witchcraft and hanged. Through Hannah, we witness the realities of religiously inspired violence against women in Britain in the 17th century, but she can also be considered to represent the silencing of women in patriarchal societies, including through the threat and use of violence, which remains an issue in the present, as the prevalence of rape and murder threats against women on social media attests, and as we're seeing in the brutal treatment of women in Iran and elsewhere. I'm going to finish with a novel first published 40 years ago, which remains one of the best known lesbian historical novels, Alice Walker's The Colour Purple. It was probably the first novel I ever read that explicitly addressed incest and domestic abuse. It could also be characterised as a women's and/or a black historical novel, and it's all these things. The Colour Purple is one of a number of lesbian historical novels that explore the interaction of violence and racism in women's lives, exposing both the abuse women and girls experience from men and their families, and that black women face in a racist, white supremacist society. The protagonist, Celie, is beaten and sexually abused by both her father and her husband. The opening page of the novel depicts Celie's first experience of rape when she's 14. First he put his thing up against my hip and sort of wiggle it around. Then he grab hold my titties. Then he push his thing inside my pussy. When that hurt, I cry. He start to choke me, saying, "You better shut up and get used to it." But I don't never get used to it. Despite the violence and brutality that Celie and other female characters face, The Colour Purple is also a story of the power of relationships between women. Celie's life is transformed when she falls in love with her husband's lover, Shug Avery. Through her relationship with Shug, Celie experiences sexual pleasure for the first time. She tells Shug that with her husband, he'd get up on you, heist your nightgown round your waist, plunge in, just do his business, get off, go to sleep. Shug says Celie makes it sound like he's going to the toilet on her, and Celie tells her that's how it feels. Later, Celie tells Shug about the abuse she's experienced from her husband, from her father, and then from her husband. He never asked me nothing about myself. He'd climb up on top of me and fuck, even with my head bandaged. Nobody ever loved me, I say. She say, "I love you, Miss Celie." And then she haul off and kiss me on the mouth. She say, like she's surprised. I kiss her back, say, too. Us kiss and kiss till us can't hardly kiss no more. Then us touch each other. Celie experiences both a spiritual and sexual transformation when she falls in love with Shug, and it becomes a turning point for her life. Whilst Walker doesn't duck the realities of racist and misogynist violence, the story nevertheless ends on an optimistic note, and perhaps that's one of the reasons for its enduring appeal. Seeley survives and ultimately thrives, giving hope to survivors for their own futures. In conclusion, lesbian historical novels can be read on more than one level and are able to give us knowledge about violence against women and girls in both the past and the present. In linking past and present through characters that readers identify with, lesbian historical fiction creates what Dinshaw calls a touch across time that both fulfills a desire for the lesbian past and stimulates the reader to consider the lesbian present. The frequent depiction of violence against women and girls in lesbian historical fiction is a form of creative activism that makes the often hidden realities of violence against lesbians visible. Thanks.